Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's very special for me to be here today. It's my first time ever in Budapest. Peter very kindly gave me a beginner's walk around the city, so I know that there are two cities, Buda and Pest. We're in Pest, right? Oh, come on. now you're teasing with me. But no, it's been a long time coming, and so I'm very, very pleased to spend at least a little bit of time here. I'm going to talk about some work from the office in London and some from the studio that I run in ETH in Zurich, and hopefully sort of blend them into kind of one project. And that project, at the moment, I would say is about nature, or at least it's about being natural. It's about gardens, it's about bricolage, which I'll describe a bit more in a moment, bricolage in making, which is sort of making do and getting by, bricolage in the territory, and I suppose it's about evolution. It's about an attitude towards architecture that is really about evolution and nature. Nature evolves. This is a garden. This is a building. It's also a client. And there will be, I suppose, try to sort of form some sort of natural history. There's an amazing essay, or an essay that's very important to me, called A Cautious Prometheus. It's very difficult to pronounce, by Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist, philosopher, which maps out a set of tasks and values that would reconnect the division between nature and culture that has caused so much damage to our environment since we became modern. And by that, I think he's talking since the Enlightenment, since rationalism. And that task is based around design. Design from the gene, design of cities, branding, the whole environment, the biosphere. And of course, that includes architecture and landscape. And as he states it, design is only ever redesign. So it's an approach which is more evolutionary than revolutionary, and more cautious maybe, and more integrated than what we were given by the moderns. One of the problems of modernity is it's fundamentally picturesque, where nature is like a kind of scenography outside of human actions. And I don't know if any of you recognize this film still. It comes from Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, which I think is probably, in film terms, the greatest essay or critique of modern landscape. Essentially, within the landscape, when the landscape is an interior, like a woodland, then it is the place where poor people, bad things happen to poor people. When the landscape opens up and becomes absolutely resplendent, ideal, Arcadian, it is where rich people live. And there is a complete disengagement between the sort of the landscape seen as a picture, and I think England is particularly culpable in this, and the one which is actually lived, which is actually the habitat of humans. And I would argue that it's all nature. Either there's no nature or it's all nature. I don't know which bit of this image one could consider to be natural, which one is not. I would say that they're pretty much cohabiting. And this is a very familiar view to me. I live between London and Zurich, so this is somehow close. And with this in mind, I think that this intersection between architecture and landscape, between trying to be natural, I suppose that I've been drawn more towards anthropology in the first place, people like Bruno Latour, but especially natural history. And I know that some of you are involved in a course which is really dealing with architecture sort of post-war, post-war to the 1980s. And some of the work here engages with that period, with the 60s, and in this case, with the 1940s, the late 1940s. And it's a book that's been a kind of revelation to me in the last couple of years called London's Natural History. I'm particularly interested in it. I live in London, I work in London, most of our work is in London. And it was a young botanist called R.S. Fitter, who shortly after the war, in 1946-47, did a total survey of the city. A city that was completely ravaged by war, and he surveys everything from the kind of the grand houses like Kenwood House in North London, its plant life, its architecture, its human life, and of course its animal life too. And the book is certainly, I think, worth reading, but actually it works as a picture essay as well. And so here I'm only going to show some of the images from this rather extraordinary book. This is Regent's Park Zoo, where Cedric Price and Lubetkin and co. built building, but showing this kind of very everyday encounters, which today may seem particularly surprising. There's going to be lots of animals in this talk, by the way. That's part of the natural history. Then also comparing these very melancholic views of sort of suburban playing fields, and then something much more monumental like Highgate Cemetery, which is where the kind of the great and the good get buried in London. Always kind of juxtaposing, let's say, the tree, the great specimen tree, as the kind of the spatial structure. Other kind of extraordinary scenes, which are almost possible today. Top left is Richmond Park in the west of London, which still has deer, which are owned by the Queen. And then the bottom left, there are two very rare species now. There's a pelican, and I think even more rare is a man in a bowler hat feeding the pelican at lunchtime. But then also suburbs. Suburbs in Ruislip, in Middlesex, or Regent's Park, the very grand park. So he doesn't judge anything. I think that that's maybe the thing that I find most compelling about the natural scientist, is that everything is equivalent and you don't judge. You look, you record, and you present what you find. So things like a typical backyard, I think this is in the East End. All of this in the kind of late 40s. A very nice eye for detail in the photography. Plate 15 shows some caterpillars that have attacked cabbages, and then you turn over the page, plate 16, and it's butterflies. So his kind of understanding of the natural history of a city as something that's continuously transforming and evolving is really fantastic. Also, just some of these pages, the women who are feeding the ducks have shoes that look like ducks. So the human is just as much part of this sort of total environment. And of course, the spontaneous gardens, particularly the one on the right, which is right by St. Paul's Cathedral, which is one of many, many gardens that just grew spontaneously in bomb sites after the war. It's not just the very big, it also deals with interiors. Insect life, this interaction between the spider's web and the window. And then this image, which seems like a bit of sort of rural England from, I don't know, anywhere from the 1920s or 1880s to the 1920s, is in fact Green Park, right in the center of London. And it's not that long ago that the city had its own complete ecology. So for me, I suppose this all points towards Latour's point, which is that we need to kind of reconnect all these elements that have been separated using design, and that design can only ever be redesign, which is perhaps why I'm interested in bricolage. So bricolage being the kind of a method of designing by which you use only a limited set of tools that are available to you. And if the scale is at the scale of making a table, a room, a chair, then it's really about tools and available materials and skill. If it's at the scale of territory, then it becomes more complex, and I would argue that the set the tools available to the architect are the survey. And the survey may be imaginary, may be scientific, may be mysterious. This is a sort of an absurdist survey that Ed Ruscha, the American pop artist, conceptual artist, did after he threw a typewriter out of a car window at 90 miles an hour and then surveys the wreckage as if he's a sort of a kind of detective in a kind of film noir. Or it might be in an archive photograph that is anonymous, whose origin you don't know, but you can only try and speculate how did the white furniture get on the white side and the dark furniture on the dark side. I think I know now, but it's taken me about 6 years to work that one out. And also, maybe bricolage is quite a nice way of avoiding the idea of the new. I think that the idea of the new can't really work anymore. Every piece of land has been used and reused, certainly in Europe, whether it be for agriculture or for building or for settlements. Most bits of natural infrastructure have been adapted, whether they be rivers or other kind of natural bodies. And actually, some processes happen in reverse. And this is something I'll come back to in the survey. On the left is the 1930s, on the right is 2012. So architecture and design, like bricolage, are fundamentally mimetic. That is to say that they work by imitation and evolution, which are fundamentally human and natural. This is how nature grows, diversifies, and this is also how we learn, by imitation. And it may be in the ends of timbers, let's say like in a classical order, which are a memory of a timber beam, or the fluted columns, which are like the gathered reeds that formed an even more ancient one. So that gets kind of redrawn, abstracted into a kind of a whole order. Or it turns up in repair, and which may be seen as a kind of a lower status, but I think is incredibly powerful when compared with creation. This is a column in a Japanese temple, which after the timber has rotted, apparently many times, they've eventually carved the footing in timber, in stone, and the stone then behaves like timber. In fact, it's a carpentry joint, not a masonry joint. But our mimetic culture sometimes leads to confusion, and I think that that's why we need design. And I'm going to pass from this sort of, you could say, prelude into now a sequence of projects which are really about seeing how some of those thoughts or some of those reflections can get played out in a project. This first one is called 96 Hands. It's a project that was designed and built by my students in ETH in 2010. They designed and built it in 2 weeks from start to finish with no power tools and only a given set of reclaimed material. The brief was for them to make a building that was big enough for all of our studio to gather in and to have a lecture. Everything is sort of, every single element is used. There is no wastage. Even the offcuts made the stools in the center. And they were only allowed to use hammers and nails. And so from an old manual about barn building, they found this detail which is to do with the shear strength, the twisting strength of a nail joint. And in order to get the right number of nails, I think you needed 21 nails to get the shear strength. If you put them in a circle, it misaligns the grain and stops it splitting. So even that little kind of technical thing becomes the sort of the decorative flower in the building. It was a temporary building. It got taken down, and another one was made. But while it was there, although it was a student project, a quick student project, it did lead very directly to this project. this kind of reused timber, the kind of the texture of the reused timber, which is for a house in London called the Tree House, which is almost the same methodology, just sort of it's grown to make a full house. It is in East London, in one of the back gardens of East London, and it is for a client called Lizzie, who has MS, multiple sclerosis, and her condition is getting worse, and she can't live vertically anymore. She used to live in the house on the left-hand side of that site, and then now lives horizontally. And she said, essentially, there was a series of kind of technical parameters that we had to meet for her needs, which were very specific. And she said, you can do whatever you like. This is some of the, I'll just move on to this next one. You can do whatever you like as long as you don't touch my mulberry tree, which is, and given the number of requirements, we thought that was a little tough on top. But in the end, it was very important, partly because of the pleasure it gives her, and that is central to even the most technical brief. It's also, gardening is one of the few things that she can still do, and also, get a lot of sort of physical and you could say sort of spiritual sensation from. But of course, the other thing, it meant that we had to bend the building around the tree, and it became much longer. When it became longer, we could have shallower ramps, because the street level is about 1.5 meters above ground level. So to bend it round the tree suddenly made a kind of walk through the garden, from the street through the garden, and then down onto the ground. The building is entirely made of wood. Even the foundations are timber. Very, very low budget. And then the cladding on the outside is an Australian hardwood that was used in railway sleepers, the sleepers that you get holding down the railway, sliced up into what they call thinnings. It's about 2 centimeters thick, and then applied untreated. And of course, there was a little homage there to the Herzog and de Meuron building, the puppet theatre, one of the very early projects, which I remember seeing as a student, and somehow the crank around the tree felt like a suitable reference. So this is kind of one house which really grew directly. In fact, the client actually named 96 Hands as as one of the kind of characteristics that she was interested in. She'd seen it on the internet or something. And that project led, you could say very directly, to the same idea, but at an even bigger scale, which is this project that's just finished in Cambridge, which is a hall of residence in Churchill College. It's for 70 students, I think, 69 or 70 students, and who have moved in 2 weeks ago. This was the site in 2008 when we did the competition. Cambridge is totally flat. It's sort of, if you were to reconnect Britain with the continent, it would kind of hit Holland. It's this very, very flat fenland. And then you get these fantastic winter mornings where this sort of mist just holds onto the ground for miles around. And that is the corner of this building here. It's one of the kind of colleges, probably worth explaining a little bit how the university works there. So you have Cambridge University on the right, is divided into about 30 colleges. Every student is a member of a college, and that's where they sleep, and that's where part of their teaching happens, one-to-one. And after the war, there was a huge drive to expand education in the UK. It was at the same time as the setting up of the National Health Service, expansion of education, social housing, sort of when the welfare state was worth something. And one of the very first projects was this one, which was Churchill College, which is a memorial to Winston Churchill. And a big competition in 1958. Stirling came second, and so on. So a lot of the big figures of British architecture took part. And essentially, it's a series of courtyards around an even bigger courtyard. And that is itself a reinterpretation of this is the center of town, which is essentially lots of monasteries that have kind of grown together to make a town. So it's a kind of monastic type that grew into a university type that then grew into a kind of its brutalist 1960s form. Cambridge is a town which is sort of not a town. I told you there's quite a lot of animals. I've tried to find as many as I can. This is this summer in the centre of Cambridge, where the kind of pasture land and leisure land are completely shared. And it's outside a pub, and students play table tennis there. The cows seem completely uninterested. And they're not quite all over the city, but quite a lot of the city. It's also where I was a student, so I sort of had some of it in my mind. This is the site. It's northwest of Cambridge, so that city centre and the cows are sort of down here. And they have all their playing fields. It is really, I mean, it's so English. This is a cricket field, grass tennis courts. The professors wear gowns and they toast in Latin. You think I'm joking? No. And our project is this white one. Weirdly, there was another competition for this project. Out of 20 offices that entered, we were the only ones to do a courtyard, which seems so blindingly obvious to me. I don't think we even discussed it in the office. Like, what do you do in Cambridge? Well, a court. But 19 out of the 20 didn't. So I've never seen really what all of the other ones are, but I can't imagine what other types would fit. But not only did we do a courtyard, we did a doppelganger courtyard. On the left is the original one, and on the right is our version. The main difference in them is that the traditional Cambridge and Oxford courtyard is based around staircases. So a staircase will serve, let's say, between 6 and 10 rooms, and each room has a student lives in it, but they never live with somebody from their own subject. So there might be somebody from architecture, somebody from medicine, somebody from philosophy, somebody from maths, physics, history, etc. And the whole idea is that your education is made by cohabiting with people in other fields. And it's a completely fantastic model. The only problem is that with every staircase you have to have a lift with current accessibility requirements and all the rest of it. So we changed the model. We have a staircase here and here, and actually it's a cloister. So all the rooms in our building face outwards, and all the common parts face inwards into a garden. We kind of thought of our building as more of a landscape building than an urban building, because it sits on its own, it's an open field, and therefore the center has a woodland as opposed to the kind of the typical grass, and you can actually go in it, which is also a big difference. And the other thing is that in the original ones, this room and this room, look at their windows, are really, really close. And so most of the time, the courtyard, the curtains are drawn. So we wanted to kind of avoid that sense of the kind of the closure of the building for privacy. So this is the building kind of just as it's finishing. And as I said, this is sort of more of a kind of landscape structure. So part of that is its outward-looking layout, but also that the form, this square, which is a repeat of the original square, actually has a kind of curve in it, a bit like entasis in a classical column, a very slight distortion that somehow makes its autonomous form more precise. And then every layer, point here, every layer is cut a little bit deeper so that then the articulation of the original college is also matched. Where they had concrete bands, we have this little cut. And this is the model. So this is sort of the idea of this square with its 2 incisions and very slight distorted form. And then in the center of it, there's an open loggia at the bottom, an open cloister, and then interior ones above it. Plan is fairly simple. On the ground floor, you have a seminar room, sort of seminar room, lecture theatre, and then rooms all the way around the perimeter. The first and second floor is the same, more or less, with slight changes in corner rooms and central rooms. Well, you have to put the roof plan in. And it's timber frame. So the fundamental difference, so on one level, the building is really, really identical to the original ones, or really similar, and we wanted it to be similar. We wanted it to feel like it had the same DNA as the Churchill building, but its character is fundamentally different, mainly the structure. It's a timber frame structure, which then sends out a whole series of consequential differences. That timber frame is visible almost everywhere in the building, especially in the bedrooms, and then you get sort of quite similar spatial relationships. This is a few weeks ago, so the trees haven't grown much yet, but they will kind of fill the whole courtyard completely. One of the older ones, one of the original ones. And our precedent was really, this is an abbey from an abbey near Cambridge called Anglesey Abbey, where in the center of the cloister there's this fabulous dense birch forest, as opposed to the kind of the specimen tree at the center. And since this is about gardens, of course it's about water, and so that space, that inner room, is really a sort of climate register. Seasons, weather, believe it or not, it does rain in England. And when it does, that really sort of somehow, it kind of explodes with life. I wasn't there when the photographer took these pictures, and I don't know how these three old men find their way into the building, but there you go. Most students are young. The structure, as I said, is a timber frame structure, very simple. It was prefabricated in Germany. It was assembled on site very, very quickly. Laminated timber. And I suppose that this is the point where it kind of becomes interesting, because what we were trying to do by making the building timber is to make it a completely different character to the original brick and concrete one. But of course that's not true. And actually materials and construction is much more alike than it's not alike. And we decided to start doing kind of rhyming games with the original. And that is, in fact, the entrance, or near the entrance to the original building. So concrete construction maybe is a memory of timber construction anyway. So the buildings end up being, you could say, deeply related in how they pick up structure, how they hold, the board marks of the ceiling in the concrete is actually very similar to the boards of the new building. It's lined in oak. So it's fresh oak around the inside. And this is a sort of bit of a walk around. The entrance is just at the end of that photograph. One of the things about courts is they tend to not do entrances. Usually a college would have a representative gate at the front, probably with a tower, with a great big door. If it's medieval, it'll have a few crests on it. And then once you're within the college, going from one court to another is just the smallest door that is practical for that purpose. So it's a sort of building without sign or without representation. That's leading then around the cloister into the staircase, which is not timber, it's concrete, because we had to have a temporary structure while it was being built. So the idea is always getting corrupted. There is always this sort of dance between, no, it has to be a pure timber building, and then it's not, because regulations or other things kind of make it so. But it is, in spirit, a concrete building timber building, I get myself confused. It's a timber building where there are elements of it which are concrete. It's almost like scar tissue. So the size of the concrete beams and posts is the same as that of the timber. And so it's always changing its condition from once so the staircases are totally concrete. Then at the top you get the windows, which look out as well. And that's the fire escape, and you can see the staircase going past the windows, which are the same as the bedrooms. You get to the top of the stairs, and as I said, all the communal spaces face inwards, and then you have this kind of view back out, down over the courtyard. The bedrooms, the original one on the right, where they were really, their sort of defining characteristic was this bay window. It was a deep window that students could sit in. Because our building, the wall thickness is so deep because of all the insulation, it's a kind of nearly passive house level. Then the window seat becomes in the depth of the wall, but it's still remembered, and that's it. Last Friday, we had the first pictures from students. The corner rooms, which are sort of quite amazing, they get two windows, but every room has then a different framed view of the surrounding landscape. That is the official Churchill College photograph. That's what it's really like, but that's better, I think. And the photographer went last week, and these are just some of the bedrooms. It's quite interesting, once you spend some time with the photographs, you can actually do, I reckon, 100% accurate gender map. So the building carries on this dance, this sort of conversation with the original building. The fenestration, which is broadly speaking a kind of stepping one at the corner, then does this sort of realignment, just like the bay windows of the original one. This is a view from the tennis courts, and then a little bit nearer. And of course, the outside of the building, which I haven't talked about, is also oak. It was really, when re-examining the original building, this is a sample of Churchill College concrete. Concrete, of course, was timber in the first place, so maybe this business about opposites is completely out of the window, especially once we started putting samples of oak beside the concrete and beside the brickwork, and suddenly you realize that actually, in color, in texture, they share actually so much. And in the end, this timber, which is reused, it's reclaimed, it's about 100 years old, ends up being much closer to the original building than perhaps we'd ever imagined. The timber itself is from railway carriages. It was the bed of goods, of freight trains in France. So we don't know exactly where it's from, but it came off very thick, incredibly good quality, and sort of already kind of blackened and aged. And we were quite interested in the building in kind of avoiding this idea of this sort of brand new object that could only ever decay. That if you start with something which is much older, then it somehow has a sort of natural texture. And this is the concrete base at the moment, where every time it rains, it pulls the tannins out of the oak and then runs down the concrete, but then it kind of rubs off with the next rainfall. There were lots of references to traditional timber frame buildings. This is Paycock House in Essex, not far from Cambridge, which I think is, in my opinion, the finest timber frame house in the country. And then it has this sort of jettying where every floor sits above, projects out from the one below to protect it from the rain. And so there's a sort of memory of jettying in our building. But there you can see the curve, which sometimes appears flat, sometimes really curved, depending on where you are. And then from the cricket field, as you kind of approach the building from the main campus, it's interesting that this willow tree was planted when the buildings were finished. So that willow tree is from 1960. To me, that's important in that, you know, it somehow feels ancient. It feels like it predates the whole college. It's so big and sort of grand. But it's not. It's kind of, well, 50-something years old. So from one timber structure and the poor old tree that was quite thick, but it's recovering now beside the building. Whoa! To another tree. This is another project that I did with my students, or I should say, actually, that's not fair. My students did. They designed it and they built it. It's a pavilion for Manifesta, which is a biennial in, sorry, it's hard to compete with Take 5. It's a biennial, a contemporary art biennale that moves around from city to city every 2 years. And it was in Zurich this year, and the curator wanted to work with students from the city to produce some of the venues that the biennale would take. And he wanted it to be in the most important public space in the city. And in Zurich, the most important public space is the lake. You know, I don't know if you know generally Swiss cities, but the lake or the river tends to be the kind of the place where the sort of city agrees to be a city. So he wanted a pavilion in the middle of the lake, floating, where there would be a cinema, a public bath, a bar, and they could show the films of all the projects that were happening dispersed in different parts of the city. The students, through a competition system and a series of collaborations, produced this design and then fabricated it in a shed outside of town, Winterthur, about 20 minutes from Zurich. And then it was brought to the lakeside and assembled. Tell you what, Swiss students are seriously precise. That is one lesson you don't need to give them. When that thing landed onto the metal base, it just slipped in, and it had been made 6 months before in another place. I mean, just slightly freaky. But if you come from England is so approximate as a culture. I think it's because of the mountains. Well, it's not entirely a joke. The infrastructure in Switzerland that was built to unite the nation, which had to tie together all the mountain villages, it really was a matter of life or death whether you got it right. You know, if you slipped, you'd be down for your death. Whereas Britain is sort of this shape. Yeah, we'll get there. You know, so there is something that's, you know, that's why they're always on time. So it was assembled on the other side of the lake, and it was dragged across the lake on the 27th of May, which was the same day as the opening of the Venice Biennale. So it was our little wave to Aldo Rossi and the Teatro del Mundo and all of that. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough fog to do a proper homage. That's the Opera House. So these projects are collectively designed, collectively built. This was by about 32 students plus some helpers, volunteers and things like that. Over about a 5-month period. All the timber wasn't donated, but nearly. It cost almost nothing. The stuff below it was rented for nearly nothing. And then there it sits in its final destination. And essentially it was a series of buildings. On the left there's the bar, on the right there's the tribune where you watch the films, the tower, just to show that it's there. It was basically designed around the idea of a kind of Italian town square, where you get a whole series of different buildings that then might form a space in the center. Then it frames views at the top back to the city, to the various steeples and churches. And then one of the biggest sort of springtime, summertime habits in Switzerland is swimming in the lake. So there's a little kind of pool, which may be the village fountain. This is the cinema. It was called the Pavilion of Reflections. The only thing that the curator stipulated was that the image of the film had to be reflected in the water. This is it kind of finished. And that's at one of the kind of screenings. It took about 400 people, and every night it would show films about the art projects. So, from one lakeside structure to another, this isn't a real lakeside structure. It's an installation at a gallery we did in London, that opened in 2009, called Raven Row. And that is also a kind of, you could say, a form of bricolage, a form of material sort of transformation. It is, this is a sort of the rear gallery with two roof lights. This is it when it was built. And those two roof lights that are in the sort of backyard are kind of housed in these sort of, I don't know, sort of structures of charred timber. And that was really part of the story of reconstituting another kind of history. So not so much like the to and fro of the Churchill one, more an invisible one. And I mentioned that photograph at the beginning, the archive photograph, was from this building about a year before this one. This is a photograph taken from 1972 when a fire ripped through the building and destroyed one of the kind of really great 18th century interiors. And lots of things after that, things were stolen from the building, other things were damaged, nobody cared. And the project became a sort of reconstitution of some of these narratives, some of these lost stories of the building. The first one being the charred timber. This is the village, the hometown of one of my colleagues, Takeshi Hayatsu, who worked on the project with me. This is his parents' hometown in western Japan, where they use charred timber as a cladding to stop insects and to protect against water and rot. He went back to Japan, learned how to do it the traditional way, which is to make a chimney out of cedar, and then you burn the inside of it like a kind of furnace. And then when it's ready, when the flames come out of the edges, the whole thing just falls apart. And there's Takesh showing the contractor how to do it. This is a very confused English contractor. And that really came from this box of photographs that I found in an archive, which included this one, and was part of this, I suppose, a whole process of transformation, this blackened room, that then got rebuilt as a white cube for a contemporary art gallery. So the roof then restored the blackness, the burntness of it. And that texture was then used in the back facade. The top of that image above the window is made of cast iron, and it's a casting of the burnt timber. That's another picture from the set where you see the cast iron railing at the top, which was stolen in the 70s when these buildings were more or less derelict and nobody cared. So bringing the cast iron back into the building, literally through the back, was a way of somehow trying to recover, in a sort of very abstract way, some of these elements. And the buildings had originally been built by French Huguenot silk makers. And this is an exhibition of silks and actually other fabrics by this chap here called Seth Siegelaub. And I would guess that not that many people have heard of him, but he's an incredibly important figure in the history of contemporary modern art. Some say that he invented conceptual art. He was in New York in the late 60s and put on the first conceptual art show. He had a gallery, and he had friends like Carl Andre, Kossuth, Lawrence Weiner, so some of these early conceptualists, and he put on a group show of conceptual art that never happened. You know, that was his kind of first and almost definitive statement. They produced a catalogue for a show that didn't happen. Then he disappeared from contemporary art, saying it was too commercial, and then collected textiles. Started collecting privately from the mid-70s textiles from throughout the world, throughout history, from flea markets in Belgium to Coptic tunics from the 3rd century AD, and wouldn't show them. He was a complete recluse. And this guy on the right is the director of the gallery, and convinced him to come out of this sort of self-imposed exile and to show his textiles, which he considered to be the only truly collective and artwork by humanity. That every culture has produced textiles. Textile is responsible for how we make law, how it's in religion, it's in gender, it's in agriculture, it's in economics, it's in trade, it's in technology. And he claimed that textiles was behind everything. So we decided to test this. So this is some of the shows from Raven Row, which we designed, which were putting together this sort of global history of textiles. And I looked at a map to see what cities had been made by textiles. And of course, in Europe, there are many, you know, from Manchester, Huddersfield in the UK, Lyon in France, Calais for lace, or Bruges, or all over. And on this 19th century map of Europe, there was a city called Forst, which is on the German-Polish border. And that city is the only one that none of us had heard of. Even German friends hadn't heard of. And we thought, how could this be? So we went to see it, to see what happened to this, the biggest textile city in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. And we made a survey. So this is a sort of the element where the kind of bricolage, the making, really kind of expands into the territory. It starts with the loom, and there's about 100 drawings in it. And then there's a series of archive photographs, and that is it in the late 30s. That's it now. In fact, that is a monument to the weavers of Forst. Now it's just buried in a woodland. That is in the 30s. It is a city divided by a river, which today is the border between Poland and Germany, and that's it now. I mean, it's so spectacular and breathtaking and kind of horrific as well. The bench with the girls, the bench is still there, but not the girls. And then the students did this whole series of drawings. I'm not sure if you can see them from at the back. Very, very fine line drawings, trying to kind of record the whole city as they saw it. This is one of the infrastructure of railways within the town. Which was this. Gardens, suburban gardens, Schreber gardens, allotment gardens. The forest, where you get occasional views that there was a city, if you look carefully enough. And then the students made a whole series of projects, which was about seeing whether within this decay, within this disappearance, you could find a future. And then they ended up making sort of propositions of a kind of retrofit garden city. So not a garden city as a kind of proposal, not a garden city as a design intention, but a garden city as a kind of found, as a grown thing. So this is a Plattenbau kind of reflected in a new lake. It looks like a cottage. Some more slightly kind of sublime visions, which are to do with the kind of energy landscape, the mining, and then trying to see how that mining proposal, which is that sort of central eastern part of Germany that has all that coal, how then that could then become a lakeside city. Everything was surveyed, even weeds coming out of rubble. We've then done a whole series of these projects around post-industrial cities in Glasgow, for example, which is a city that was built for a million people, but 500,000 people live there now. This is the sort of the formation of the Clyde, which is the river that runs through Glasgow, and that made this. This is early 20th century, when Glasgow was the second wealthiest city in the world. It was known as the workshop of the world. It's all gone. It's a kind of extraordinary photograph. Every one of these cities has a kind of global map to do with trade, whether it was Forst or Glasgow. Galway in Ireland is another one we've done. I think the next one we're going to do is probably Palermo. And then recording all the sort of, as many, you could say not all, certainly not all, as many of the significant buildings, landscapes, infrastructures that we can. So this is the second reinforced concrete building in Scotland, in Glasgow. It's a very strange program. It's a lawyer's office and artist studios. The lawyer who had it built really liked art and thought it would be nice to have a few in the attic, so the upper section. And the students who drew it then drew the project basically as reinforcement. You know, this is the second reinforced concrete building in Scotland, and the first one is the one at the bottom of the page, which is this one, which is also very beautiful but completely derelict building, and then made a series of proposals about how you could sort of stop that process of decay by putting in a caretaker. So very, very light interventions where there was a process of repair to the reinforcement and then kind of protection and sort of caretaking of these buildings until a bigger use might come along. It's very much a kind of condition of post-industrial Europe. We found some of the kind of earliest maps, the development of the grid. Glasgow is a grid city. It's almost like an American city. So you have the medieval city there, Europe, America. And of course, it was the last stop for all the immigration going from Europe, particularly Italy, to America on the kind of western tip. Bits of infrastructure, these tunnels. I mean, this is a lift shaft that took horses and carts. Oops. Okay, we have a technical fault here. Boom. Okay. I'm sorry about this. Bear with me. Is that coming on again? Oh, we're nearly at the end. One. Okay, so this was some more projects. I'll go quickly through them, where they turned the flyover, this sort of crazy bit of infrastructure that ripped through the city, into a kind of Uffizi. This is the Italian connection, where kind of columns are added, classical columns are added to kind of the 70s brutalism to make a kind of a sort of a park side and a city side where kind of guys and gals can meet. Drawings which were about the canals, or about the tenements, which is the kind of the main housing type in Glasgow that's set around courtyards, and then they proposed new public uses for these courtyards, which are generally rubbish dumps now. Swimming pools, optimistic for Glasgow, but like that. And a whole series of sort of public rooms that you could walk through. Most of these tenements usually have one bit at least missing. It was very heavily bombed during the war as well, because it's an important strategic location. Car parks turned into kind of Italianate squares. All of this is basically one great big derelict car park. That's a shopping centre. And that they would be a kind of riverside piazza, where the water would rise and fall in the piazza to match the river. They perfected the rendering of rain during that semester. Glasgow, it rains more than 300 days a year in Glasgow, just in case you're thinking of going. All these buildings are demolished. This is a map of all the demolition, which is absolutely scandalous. The demolition of public housing over the last 15 years. These are now gone. This is some mappings of how these were inhabited, the sort of partial habitation, and then the shipyards that then you can see the ship sailing off to America there. Glasgow has always been kind of pointing towards America. This is one of the design studios in the shipyards, extraordinary places, completely derelict. And then they proposed to turn it into Cinecittà, so another kind of Italian reference. But Glasgow is almost one of its greatest industries is filmmaking. So I don't know if you've seen things like Shallow Grave or Trainspotting, or those kind of films are coming out of the kind of the Glasgow art and cinema scene. Old dockyards became water treatment centres and ice rinks and so on. So it's all just about reusing what you find. Walk drawings, botanical gardens, and then accidental gardens. This viaduct that has the with abandoned railway, it's almost like it's got its high line before New York did, but it's completely spontaneous. You can see the kind of the woodland just kind of going across the bridge. And then this is going back to Force, the first one, and of course the main image there is of the ruin. And maybe the greatest, I suppose, romantic about the ruin was an English architect called John Soane, late 18th century, early 19th century. So really the beginning of the Romantic period. Like a lot of English architects, he did the grand tour to Italy. He actually met Piranesi. So he was a very young man. Piranesi was a very old man. They met, and Piranesi gave him an etching, one of the etchings of the ruins. This is his competition entry for the Bank of England. I mean, that's pretty bold. But it's a fragment of it. It was drawn by Joseph Gandy, and you can see here things like the kind of woodland that's appeared in the banking hall. And he kind of considered the ruin, which has kind of run right into our culture now, as the sort of the liberated state of architecture. It's where architecture and nature have found a new balance. It's where architecture is free of program, it's free of people. It can just be what it wants to be. It's incredibly romantic and obviously completely, or nearly completely impossible. This is his own house, which is almost like a kind of compacted ruin. And while we were studying all of this, we always do these big city projects alongside the construction projects. So we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could remake this room, which is the picture gallery, which is only an interior, is completely buried in the city block. This is the room, and rebuild it one-to-one. Each one of these panels opens up to reveal more paintings and more paintings. He was a kind of crazy collector. And that's it, rebuilt exactly one-to-one. Even if you look at the top, there's little acorns decoration, carved acorns. Those are then remade as light bulbs. It's this idea, I suppose, of imitation and then mutation. And of course, it's got to have a structure. So this is something that had to be invented. This is the picture gallery as it kind of opens up. And eventually, behind all these screens, one after the other, more and more pictures, suddenly you've got a courtyard. This is it, opening up. We couldn't borrow the paintings. But then it does open up to the courtyard and to the tree. And it brings me on to this final project, which is kind of like another examination of the Sohn idea of this kind of completely inner world of pictures and light, top light, introspection for this studio for a photographer. So this is the very first model that we did, a paper model of an idea of a sequence of light spaces, dark spaces, light spaces, dark spaces, almost like a kind of an infinite sequence of rooms. Of course, it can never be as ideal as that. It's London, and London is messy and approximate, as I've already said. So we had to find a way of building in which we could accommodate something kind of new and really robust with something kind of crumbling and vague. It's for a photographer, a German photographer called Jürgen Teller, who is kind of straddles the boundary between fine art and fashion, and is, I suppose, one of the leading architects in the photographers in the UK. This is one of his pictures of the painter David Hockney, and one of the things that characterizes his work is that you could say he's very natural. He always photographs his subjects and their environment as a totality. He never uses a white background. He never kind of uses one of those studios with the kind of infinity cove. It's always about the situation and, you know, even the ash garden that's going all over Hockney's. He's very famous for smoking, even in the Tate. Or his mother in the landscape. So he goes back to Germany quite often to do landscape work. This is him. This is a self-portrait on his 50th birthday. Again, food, animals, and I think maybe much more lyrically, his daughter, which has, if you know about pre-Raphaelites and people like that, the sort of, there's a kind of painterly history in all of this. And he was very keen that that sort of total environment could be found in the studio. So the first compromise to our project was this dark wall that turns out it was an old brick wall that Jürgen owns as part of the site, but the neighbors had built sheds, garden sheds against it and grown plants up it. And then Jürgen thought it was a very mean thing to do to knock it down, even though they weren't meant to. And so we had to keep it. And that was really the beginning of, you could say, a project which is about willful compromise. So the project starts in an idealized form as three buildings, three gardens, and then at every turn it gets, the street is here, it's 70 meters long, 7 meters wide. The street is here, so there's only one window to the outside, which is there. And then there's a building, garden, building, garden, building, garden. The first building is the most public, has things like post-production, archives, office, admin, that sort of thing. Then there's a garden, then there's a studio, then there's a garden in the most private part, which then has a dining room, a kitchen, a library, a sauna, and a little private garden at the back. And essentially, our take was that this is a section through the Sohn house. It's this completely internalized world with light coming in from above and a kind of horizon made out of pictures with just a sequence of rooms. This is something you really shouldn't do with architectural history. But there you go. Yeah, I think you sort of get the point. It's things like that cause Brexit. This is the site. Actually, I did want to say, when you said the New English, I suddenly went, with Brexit, I don't want to be the New English. This is the site. It's a kind of pretty crappy suburban street in West London. You can get electrical supplies and cheap paint and so on. So it's a very kind of anonymous bit of town. The site is here. They're very long, thin sites. Very few of them remain. They were where the laundry was done for London. So every neighborhood of London tends to have a kind of a national identity. So Spitalfields is French, it's Huguenot, textiles. West London, near Gorbourne Road, is Portuguese, cleaning. So in the 19th century, the Portuguese did all the cleaning. There are other bits of London which are, let's say, Caribbean, other bits which are historically Dutch. And so this is sort of part of the kind of Portuguese district, and you can still get things like fried sardines on the street and kiosks and stuff like that. Building in London is always messy, and it always ends up in mud. London is made of clay, and somehow everything you do always ends up in this sticky stuff from which actually the good thing about it is it holds water. So when you have a good topsoil on top of the clay, you can have great gardens. There you go. That's the kind of the diagram of the building from public to private. I don't like that term, but it's sort of useful. And then the gardens, which sort of loosely go from hard to soft. So it is really a project that's about this idea of the spontaneous garden. The idea of what just grows in a city when you just leave it, when you leave a few cracks. And this is the garden earlier this summer, or towards the end of summer, another animal, a fox. And the ground of the garden was basically made with concrete, poured concrete, but with no reinforcement, and then kind of smashed in order to let the thing grow. And these are maybe about a month apart, these two photographs, so you can see how the garden really goes. Great brickwork in London. That's that wall. This is Jürgen Teller on site. One of the really interesting things about the project is it was a studio before the building was there. The moment the builder started, he was photographing there all the time, actually doing shoots. So that's an ad campaign for Prada on site. There's the mud I was telling you about. She's a yoga teacher, barefoot on site with Prada handbags. Building in London is approximate. You're always smashed up against something else. And then you end up with these encounters. And that one of the reasons for the concrete, amongst many, was this idea of flowing in to the kind of the sort of the irregular remains of the other building. So some of his work in a book, and then pictures he took on site. When we did the demolition, found this bit of structure remaining, and it turns out that it was exactly central to one of the gardens, so we just kept it. Jürgen thinks it's T for Teller. I know what it's T for. And that's the garden, the first garden, with this kind of broken ground. This is Jürgen on site, looking through from the upper level at the neighboring housing. And then this is one of the photographs, one of the portraits that he took there. So everything, even the stuff outside the building, these fragments of other people's satellite dishes, is the space of the studio. These bits end up somehow having to be accommodated with the building. This is another one of Jürgen's photographs, so I'm sort of going between, I suppose, my photographs and his. Planting, which is one of the most weird and wonderful processes, either to see a plant grow or to see a mature one arrive. These are it's a bit like La Dolce Vita and the flyover scene. It's incredibly physical. This is another one of Jürgen's photographs. So this is part of his practice, even before the building is done, bringing these trees in, and then sort of settle this kind of broken ground, sort of ruinous. So essentially the building is a ruin, is imagined as a ruin. That's it a few months later. And now you more or less can't see through the gardens. So we're going through, this is from the first building looking back. You can see the top of the trees. So we're going to go essentially end by walking from here down that way. The first room is a double height space. It's all with concrete beams running the whole length of the site, with roof lights, with light coming in from above. Special little rooms to the side for post-production, for archiving, and so on. The one view out to the street. He doesn't stop at his own front door. This is a photograph of a Japanese thrash metal band, which he took. He was shooting inside, and he decided that there were these bags of sand and gravel, which are part of the garden, that were waiting outside. So he came out just at the moment that our photographer was there shooting the building. So we've got him shooting them and the building. So that's Jürgen Teller, that's architecture. And then the beginning of the garden on the front even. So coming in, he added this little house right at the end of the project for an electric car. It's got a little kind of charging point. And then when you enter, there's just this long tube that runs the whole length of the building. It's big enough to put a transit van through it with kind of props or work. Along the way, there's a light shaft that then separates these two rooms. So this is this kind of Sonian set of sort of chambers within chambers within chambers. Little kind of then bridges that cut through. Then out to the first garden, and then into the studio. So this is all the rooms always have light from two sides, so from the ceiling and from the side, mainly because it's a different color light, and that was something that he was very interested in. Stairs, which sort of are kind of going to nowhere. They go up to a storeroom, but they're mainly a place to sit for people to be shot against. So that is the sort of the studio, the main room at the center, a double height space made of concrete block on the sides, and then concrete sort of stabilizing, tying the whole thing together. And then this is one of his photographs of the musician, I think for a concert catalogue. So now the whole building, or every bit of the building is part of the studio. It's sometimes empty like this. He has a kind of biblical, he's gone through this sort of slightly biblical scene. This is obviously Adam and Eve, and based on the painting by Cranach. Interestingly, got all the animals around. So that is the carpenter who made the door. That's the donkey coming. And the only reason the carpenter is just so worried that he's going to kick the door and damage it. And this is one of a series of self-portraits that he's done of him on a camel. There's a whole long story. I'm not going to go into it. Why there's a donkey? But anyway, there's Jürgen on the. So every element, every part of the building, sort of becomes part of the scene. Even the ceiling, which lets the north light in. Then this is a picture of Vivienne Westwood's husband lying on a carpet of Vivienne Westwood, but then set out against this kind of roof. These kind of very narrow stairs that go up to storerooms, which are also essentially just for kind of showing off. And then the second garden, which is even more dense. And then now it's got this kind of water butt that catches all the water from the roof, which then is used to irrigate the gardens, of course. And then going back, this was it in April this year, summer, late summer, and now you almost can't see through it. There's Jürgen Teller kind of on the phone at the, only probably about 3 meters away. Another photo shoot, this time with the fox. The fox becomes the guide through the building, and it's a sort of love affair between the subject, Charlotte Rampling, and this fox. And they make it up together at the end. So in the end, you could say that these projects are kind of all about the weather and the passage of time. And what will happen in the future, and in our case it's mostly rain, beautiful rain, that makes the garden grow. Whether it's 96 Hands, or Glasgow, or Forced, design is about scale, nature, and about time. And it's about history, it's about tradition, continuity. And it's about tolerance, but it's equally about departures, surprises, and shifts, because I think that's our nature. Thank you very much.